Hi everyone. In the next couple of videos, I'm going to show you how to code a dynamic sort of website like this, where you can make beautiful pictures at scale. It's going to be our first sort of real project that looks like an actual beautiful website. Now, in order to get there, we're going to need to understand a few things. One piece is how do you actually space and position elements with CSS? And that's called the CSS Box Model. And then we're also going to need to know how to change text. So far we've been doing HTML with just the built-in default browser font, which is usually incredibly ugly. And you don't really want to do it that way. So we're going to talk a little bit about fonts and how to do fonts. So we're going to set those two things up this video. The next video, we're actually going to go through putting images in and spacing it all like this. Okay, so first of all, let's talk about how you actually position elements. So this is W3 School's CSS Box Model page. And the reason I'm going here is because they've got a fantastic image explaining the different parts of, or different sizes and positioning of elements. So when you have an element in HTML, that is the content. And the content takes up however much space it takes up. So let's create a simple HTML file. So let's save this as, let's just do example.html. Okay. So we're just testing some stuff here. So if we have, let's make an H1 title. All right. So now when we open this up, here we have the title. And if I right click and inspect, you can see the H1 has the blue box. That blue box around the H1 is the actual size of the element. And then there's also a margin that gets added automatically. And if you look down here, it's got margin of 0.67 EM. Now, EM isn't something that we've talked about. EM is a relative font size that you get from the parent element. It's sort of complicated, but basically 2 EM means that it's double the size of the parent element. And the H1 element, if we look at our text, H1 comes from body. So body has some font that's set by the browser, and that's usually about 16 pixels. For most browsers, it's 16 pixels. And so with this code here, this EM2 means that it's going to have double that, so 32 pixels height. And it's going to have a margin that's 0.67, so about 2/3 of 16 pixels. So it's got roughly a 10 pixel border above and below. That's what these things mean. Okay, so it has some margins and some content. And this H1 doesn't have any border and doesn't have any what's called padding. So let's look at this box model and talk about what padding and border. So border we've already seen. Border puts an edge around content. So let's put a border around our H1 and see what it looks like. And it's going to be pretty ugly. So let's just do it right here just for testing. So let's do border. Let's make it big so we can really see it. Let's do 10 pixels, solid. Let's do red. Sure. So if we refresh this, you can see now that the title, when we look at it, it's got a border going directly around the element. And in particular, it's quite ugly because the border is basically touching the title. And usually you don't want that. So we want something called padding between the content of the H1 tag and the border. And the padding puts a little gap between what you actually have in your element and the border you have around it. So let's add some padding. Let's add padding of, let's say 5 pixels. So now when we refresh, you'll see that there's a nice space between the title and the border. Now, another thing that makes this really, really ugly is that it's way too wide, right? Like that box looks incredibly silly going all the way across the page when our title is so short. So we're going to want to make a width for this element as well. So let's give it a width of, and there's a bunch of ways you could do width. You could do width in terms of pixels. So let's try that first. Let's do 300 px for pixels. And you can see that makes it 300 pixels wide. Another way you can define width is in terms of a percentage, and the percentage is a percentage of the thing that it's within. So this H1 is inside of the body. So if I set a percentage in here of, say, I don't know, 25%, that means it's going to be 25% the width of the body of the document. So let's hit save on this and refresh. And now that it's percentage, that means that if I, let's close inspect. By closing inspect, I've made the web page wider. If I make it narrower, you can see that it dynamically shrinks or grows as I stretch or change the page. So let's inspect, oops, not view page source, inspect rather. One other note about the body itself has a margin. So browsers automatically add margins around websites. That's that orange box you're seeing around. And if you want, you can actually get rid of that in CSS as well. So if we go into our CSS, our body, we can say style for our body, and we can make the margin 0. Now, normally you need units here. You need like pixels or percent or EM or REM. But in this case, with 0, you don't actually need units because 0 is the same regardless of your units. And if I refresh this, you will now see that my thing is actually touching the edge of the screen. And usually you don't want that. Usually that people think that looks kind of ugly. So we're going to take that out right now. But just something to know about your box model is that even the body of your HTML document also follows the box model with a margin. And you can give your body a border. You could give your body padding as well. So let's say we wanted this thing, the whole outside of our website to have, I don't know, a 5-pixel gray border with maybe a 5-pixel gap before it gets to the content. That's something we can do. We can say style equals margin 5 pixels, padding 5 pixels. And that will make it so there's, what am I saying, margin? We wanted a border. Border 5 pixel solid. Let's just do gray. Actually, gray's kind of ugly. Let's do a light gray. A light gray would be something like DD. If all the numbers are the same in your hexadecimal, it's going to be a gray or black shade. So refresh that, and now we've got a 5-pixel border all the way around our body, and it doesn't go right to the bottom of the screen because the only thing that's actually in our document is this H1 element. Where is it? Here we go. There's our H1. So it goes right to the edge of the H1, and then there's a 5-pixel gap before it gets to the border of the body. Okay, so that's the basic idea behind the box model. And in terms of margin and border and padding, you can actually define it for each edge of your thing separately. So if you want more padding above or more padding below, or more margin above, more margin below, or you only want a border on certain edges, you can do that just by adding a border dash, say, bottom. So this is going to make it that the border for our H1 is only at the bottom of the element, which is going to look a little bit silly, but sure enough, well, actually, maybe not. Maybe underneath actually looks pretty good. That looks much better than I thought it would, actually. It's kind of like an underline for our title. And so that's a nice way that you can make a defined underline, overline, whatever. Maybe this body paragraph, well, anyway, whatever. Let's move on to actually making this box model, or this portfolio. So to make this portfolio, we're going to actually want to make several boxes right next to each other. And we're going to need another property to be able to do that. And that's something called a float. So let's go back. We're going to keep working with H1s for now. Let's make another H1. H1, let's do second title. And let's change this into a style tag so we can actually change both of our, H1s at the same time. So we want this in H1, and let's take all of this style stuff, cut that out there, and put it in here instead. So it'll change all of our H1s, not just one H1. Okay, get rid of that because we don't need it anymore. And let's just get rid of our body style. Okay, so let's take a look at what this is. So I've got title, I've got second title. So when I go back here and refresh, I now have title and second title. Now, if I'm going to want these things to be next to each other, there's a property in CSS that lets us do that, and it is called float. So what we can do is we can do float, and float you can set to make your element float essentially up. Imagine kind of like, I don't know, bubbles in a pool or something. It'll float up until it gets to the left edge of the element. So if we change that to float left, then all of a sudden the second title is right next to title. And it's a little bit confusing with these borders really touching. So let's take a look. There's our first H1, and there's our second H1. Okay, let's give them a little bit of margin so we can actually see what's going on here. Let's do margin, let's do, I don't know, 10 pixels. So we can see the gap between them. So now you can clearly see your first title and your second title. And now that I've added that float, I can add more H1s. So let's do H1. Let's just put some text in here and let's duplicate that a bunch of times and see what happens. So now I've got a bunch of titles and it goes boom, 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 boom. And that's basically how this was done. What you've done, what these are is they're actually divs that have background pictures, and they've got a float left so that this element, instead of normally block line elements go below, by setting float left, it floats up to the left edge of the element, or it floats up to the, well, anyway, whatever. It floats up above. Okay, so last thing we're going to want to do for skill building for this is we're going to want to talk about how to change font. Because right now this is just really ugly, like, I don't know, Times New Roman-y something. I don't know. Oh, it's not Times New Roman. Anyway, whatever it is, it's not great. It's kind of an ugly font. And so let's go through how to change fonts. And so the problem with fonts is that fonts are defined by the browser, or not the browser, the operating system you are using. Windows has its own set of built-in fonts. OS X has its own set of built-in fonts. If you've heard of something called Linux, Linux has its own fonts. And so you basically can never guarantee that anyone on the internet has a particular font on their computer. And so a number of years ago, designers came up with the solution of sharing font files with the user, like you'd upload a font file into your HTML the same way you'd upload an image. But that's kind of complicated. You need to have rights for font files. It ends up being a huge mess of whatever. And so, of course, Google comes up with a nice solution for everybody, which is fonts.google.com. And fonts.google.com are all of these just fonts that anyone can use anywhere on the internet. And they give you all of the code that you need to use that on any website. So let's, I don't know, Oxygen. I'll just choose that arbitrarily. So if you click on this font here, it's a nice looking font, and you can select the styles that you want. And these numbers, by the way, these are the weight of the font. I might as well play with that now. So let's select the regular weight and the bold weight. So I'm going to hit select the style and select the style. And then on the right-hand side, review is just keeping track of what you've added or not. What we want is the embed. And this code right here is what you're going to put in the head of your HTML document to load the fonts into your web page. So if we go up here, above the style, I'll put a link. So this link is going to pull this font from Google, and it's telling Google that we want both the 400 and the 700 weight. The other thing they have here is they have the rules to specify the family. So the way this works is it's going to ask for Oxygen, and then comma, and then this is just in case it breaks. If for some reason Google is down, not that that would ever happen, but I don't know, maybe someone's looking at a file offline or something and their internet's, not very good, then it will default to whatever sans serif. Sans serif means it doesn't have the little ticky stuff, right? These little like ticks on text like that. It'll just default to whatever sans serif font there is on the computer. So what we need to do then is go into our Sublime text. And if we want to use this everywhere, not just H1s, we can set body to be font family Oxygen sans serif. So we'll save that, and then we can refresh. And all of a sudden, we've got this nice, slick, modern-looking font in our web page. And these are H1s, so H1s default to bold when it's available. So that is the font weight of the font. Helps if I spell weight properly. And right now, I believe it is 700 because I think H1's default to bold. Yes, that doesn't change anything. But if you don't want, oops, you don't need to see my screen recording. If you don't want it to be bold, you can actually change the font weight to 400. Because if you remember, we loaded the regular, which is 400 weight of the font. So if I hit save on that and refresh the web page, you will now see the non-bolded 400 weight version of the Oxygen font. Okay, so that's sort of the skill building we're going to need in order to build this photo portfolio. The next video, I'm going to show you guys where you can get images like this that are free to use. I didn't take any of these pictures. I am not that talented at photography. I'll be the first one to admit. But all of these photos that I've chosen are completely free and legal for anyone to use. So I'm going to show you guys how I found those. And then I'm going to show you a little sort of trick that we use to load these images into div elements so that you can make them look really nice and slick like this and dynamically resize.